Good morning, everybody. Find your seats. We are going to go ahead and begin, even though some folks are still wandering in. So let's begin by singing hymn 157.
Maker, let all within me bless
Pastor Ben Russell from Trinity Presbyterian Church in Valparaiso, Florida, will open us in prayer.
Let us pray. Our great God and Father in heaven, we thank you this morning for condescending to us, for loving us faithfully as a Father who regards and remembers our frame as dust. We thank you and praise you for your covenant-making and covenant-keeping ways. I thank you, Father, for Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church, for this holy house, those who minister and worship here. Guard and keep and flourish her in faithfulness and purity. And now each of our speakers this day, endue them with your Spirit so that the words of their mouths and the meditations of our hearts would be pleasing and acceptable in your sight. We ask it in the holy name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Got one announcement about the questions. Make sure for the questions that you're using the blue pieces of paper there, try to write big and clearly for our question and answer session later on this morning. Do we have any other announcements? No? Okay, then we'll be followed by Dr. Peter Leithart speaking to us on the idea of a Christian society.
Good morning. Since this is my last time to be in front of you solo, I want to take the opportunity to thank Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church for putting on the conference, for Steve's work and organizing it, for Drew's work, Jackie behind the scenes, and others I'm sure do all the work to get it all organized. So thanks to everyone who's put time into making this happen. And I want to particularly thank Jared and Glenn for the music, and just make a comment about that. As I speak in different churches, some in the CREC, but also around the country, one of the things that impresses me about CREC churches in particular is the vigor of the singing. I get almost physically knocked over when I'm at Providence in Pensacola. And that's just Yuri singing. It's nobody else. It's just Yuri singing is enough to create vibrations that actually physically move you and also make you a better singer. I mean, I'm sure that Yuri's singing through me when I try to follow along. That's not a small thing, and it's a rare thing. For those of you who have grown up in a church that sings like Auburn Avenue sings, or like Providence sings, or like some of the other churches in our group of churches sing, you have a rare privilege to be growing up in that kind of church and to be part of that kind of church. And it's not just a matter of the excitement of the music. This is something that came home to me, particularly as I was working through Revelation, and noticed that the martyrs of Revelation, the 144,000 martyrs who are marked out as the final sacrifices to bring an end to the old order and to bring in a new order. Those 144,000 are prepared for martyrdom by song. They learn the song of heaven, and the last time we see them before they're harvested, before they shed their blood, is collected on Mount Zion surrounding the Lamb and singing the songs of heaven. When you're singing, you're preparing yourselves for faithful witness and martyrdom. It is a faithful witness to sing with vigor, to sing as a company of people the praises of God. But it's also a preparation. You're preparing yourself to give your life for the Lord Jesus. And you are actually doing that. You're expending your life's breath in praise of God. So keep it up and know that when you're doing that, the Lord is using that to form you as a people that are ready for anything that comes. My last talk is The Idea of a Christian Society. That's a title that comes from a little essay by T.S. Eliot, revived recently by Rusty Reno, R.R. Reno, who's the editor of the Catholic journal First Things. He wrote a recent book called Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. And my premise or my argument throughout this this last talk is that we have an opportunity with the fraying and collapsing of an old order that seems to be happening around us. We have an opportunity to press the claims of Christian society, to press the claims of Christ in society in ways that may not have been available in the past. I think one of the most impressive things about Trump's candidacy and presidency has been how much he's exposed the fragility of the political and intellectual elites of our country. Could you have imagined that 4 or 5 years ago that the Clintons would be basically finished as a political power in the Democratic Party even? The kinds of things that are going on in the Democratic Party look a lot like jockeying to keep Hillary from being the candidate in 2020. When you have senators who are forced out of the Senate by Democratic senators because of sexual harassment, I mean, can Bill Clinton survive that kind of scrutiny? Can he survive in this atmosphere? But Trump, of course, exposed the fragility of the GOP establishment just as much. You remember the lineup of, 17 GOP candidates, and Trump, a complete outsider, using completely unorthodox methods. You take one bombastic guy who speaks whatever is on his mind, whatever thought might be flitting through at the moment, and the whole thing kind of crumbles overnight, it seems. What looked like this juggernaut of a political establishment proves to be not only snobbish, but extremely weak, extremely fragile. And I think for all of you might worry to some extent about Trump's constant attacks on the media. Much of it is justified, but the media has taken many hits and been exposed as not a neutral, balanced observer of events, but a participant in events and a participant very much on one side of the political spectrum. Trump has exposed the fragility of the establishment, and I think opens up an opportunity for us as Christians to press a case for a different organization of our common life that takes Christianity more fundamentally, that puts Christianity more fundamentally into the public conversation. It opens up an opportunity to make the case that Christianity is essential to societal health. It opens up an opportunity for us to say that liberalism can't achieve its aims, can't achieve genuine freedom, which is what it purports to be pursuing, without a foundation of Christian faith. Rich is exactly right when he said earlier this week that liberalism, as I've been describing it, this drive for autonomous freedom, is a Christian heresy, but it can't survive the collapse of the Christian foundations that gave birth to it. And we have an opportunity to make that case. Freedom, the dignity of the human person, all the kinds of things, diversity, as Rich mentioned last evening, all the kinds of things that are liberal order values can't be genuinely pursued and genuinely established in a sane way apart from Christian faith. We should press this case not only within the churches, but I think we have an opportunity to press this case in public life. What is public life? Public life, a public event, is an event that is watched by people who are aware of others watching it. This is a public event because you're not all participating. You're all sitting there. I hope you're listening. This is not a town meeting where everybody has a chance to participate. You have a chance to ask questions, but you have to write them down. Very orderly kinds of question and answer. But it is a public event because I'm speaking in a setting where you are watching me. Maybe people on Facebook are also watching me. And you're aware that other people are experiencing the same things. That's what a public is. Simple as that. And we have all kinds of public spaces in which we can press the case for Christianity. And I think we have an opportunity to do that in a way that we didn't even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. In newspapers, letters to the editor, online, radio, television, in various kinds of public fora in local communities. I've been impressed over the last year, particularly as I've done some study of the work of Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, at his boldness in making a case for Christianity in a very secularized context in Europe. And he's completely aware of the conditions of Europe. He's not papering over any of the flaws of European society. He recognizes just how desperate things are. But he also has confidence in the truth of Christianity, and that truth can prevail and be heard and be accepted and embraced even within this hostile, highly secularized environment. I think that's a model for us. He's pressing his case for Catholicism in particular, but he's pressing a case more generically for Christianity as the answer to European society's problems. And I think we have a similar kind of opportunity today. This is a perennial requirement, a perennial calling of the church in any case. The church, as I said, is the new city that descends from heaven after Babylon falls. When Babel's fall, Jerusalem always survives. Jerusalem is always there, and Jerusalem is, as I said yesterday, a city of light. A city of light not only because the residents of Jerusalem are in the light of the Lamb, but also because the light of the city radiates. That's necessary to light. That's one of the features, one of the phenomena of light. One of the things that makes light is that it radiates. You can't have a city of light that just provides light for those inside. If it's truly a city of light, then we're letting the light of our good works shine in the world so that those who are outside can see it and glorify their Father in heaven. Let me read again a portion of Revelation 21 that I read. And again, think of this as a vision, a model, a poetic description of what the church is always called to be. And I think we have a particular opportunity to press the case for Christianity today. John writes, this is Revelation 21, beginning in verse 21. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold like transparent glass. And I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of the sun or the moon to shine upon it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. The glory of God is present in the city. The city is full of lights. Because it's full of light, it's full of life. Light is necessary to life. Because it's full of light, it's full of glory. Light not only is glory in the Bible, but light glorifies. Light makes other things glorious because it makes them visible. Light brings things to visibility. Light adorns things. The glory of God illumines a city. Its lamp is the Lamb. It's a city of glory internally. And the nations, verse 24 says, the nations shall walk by its light, and the kings of the earth shall bring their glory into it. And in the daytime, for there shall be no night there, its gates shall never be closed. And they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it, and nothing unclean. And no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. I'll continue into chapter 22, a few verses. And he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And in the middle of the street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. Again, the purpose of the city is to receive the light of God, but everything that's in the light is light, Paul says. Everything that is in the light is light. That's physically true. Everything that comes into light reflects light and becomes a light bearer as well as a recipient of light. Again, that's the nature of light. And the city, being a recipient of the light of God and the glory of God, shines that light into the world. The city, the place where the Lord has set up his throne, is also the source of a river of water which feeds trees that have leaves for the healing of the nations. This is, as I say, our perennial calling, our perennial vocation as a church, not just to close in on ourselves. We have to truly be in fellowship with the light that is the Lamb, with the light of God, in order to radiate light. But we can't be simply recipients of light. We need to be reflectors of the light that we receive from God. Well, how do we work this out specifically in our particular time? I want to highlight 5 areas of public life, public discourse. These are less areas of policy discussion. I don't have particular policy prescriptions for any of these things. I don't have that kind of expertise or creativity. But I want to present is the kind of stance that the church can take in the present day in order to be that light and that healing, that healing fruit and healing leaves for the nations, provide those healing leaves for the nations. The kinds of arguments, the kind of stance we should take, and the kind of arguments we can present that I think will have a resonance in our present day in a way that they haven't in the past. As liberalism and the liberal establishment phrase and fragments, we have an opportunity to provide an alternative. 5 things. First of all, let me speak a little bit about immigration and refugees. This is the kind of the cutting edge of the problem of globalization. You want an existential experience of globalization. For many people around the world, it's a matter of the movement of people. Money moves around, goods move around, commerce is carried on around the world, and that's all, those are things that we can see happening. We can see the fruits of that. But the thing that really makes it existentially real and problematic for people is the movement of populations. It's the movement of people from one country to the other. This is what has created a backlash in Europe. As I mentioned, I think the first evening, large numbers of refugees coming into Europe, large numbers of immigrants who don't have a European background, large numbers of immigrants into the United States that are seen as a threat in a couple of ways. A threat to the economic well-being of certain people in the U.S. population, because people coming from Mexico and other South American countries take jobs that would belong to Americans, and perhaps are drawing on public benefits without paying into the system. There's an economic threat, but probably more deeper than that, I think, is a perceived, a visceral sense of threat to our way of life. These people that move into your town from another part of the world, do they share your values? Do they share your goals for your town? Sometimes it's hard to tell because it's hard to communicate with people that don't speak your language. They may not speak English. You may not speak the language that they have. That's where the threat comes from, and that's where the backlash comes from. The thing that really cemented Trump's support was his forthright attention to the immigration issue, which nobody else was willing to touch in the 2016 election. Whether he dealt with it wisely or well is another question, but he addressed it, and nobody else was even asking the question. The backlash to globalization takes the form of a backlash against rising numbers of refugees, rising numbers of immigrants, and what seems to be a threat to national identity, and for some people, to racial identity, to ethnic identity. I think the church has a unique role in this, a unique place in this discussion, because the church, as I said yesterday, is neither a nationalist entity nor simply a globalist entity. Its interests are not merely in preserving the national identity of the United States or of Germany or some other country, nor is it simply a matter of the church isn't interested in just breaking down all national barriers. Nations are good, and nations, as I suggested yesterday during question and answer, have a peculiar glory to them that reflects something about the glory of God. The church stands to some extent outside this discussion, and I think because of that can provide a kind of clearinghouse, if the church does nothing else than to recognize and acknowledge the appropriate worries, fears of all sides of the immigration debate, then I think the church has offered a public service. If Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Church had a public forum here in Monroe and had somebody who was pro-immigration, somebody who was anti-immigration, and they were able to discuss that publicly, reasonably, with the reasonable Pastor Steve Wilkins as moderator, pointing out the legitimate claims of both sides, and there are legitimate claims on both sides. The church will affirm the goodness of nations. The church affirms that nations have the power and the right, the authority to protect themselves from not only from physical threat, but to preserve a culture. That's a real power of nations and of governments. The church will recognize that national difference is good and that simply homogenizing all nations into one is not what the gospel envisions. But the church will also say that national boundaries and national identity are not ultimate. The church will also say that refugees and immigrants are creatures made in the image of God and are to be treated with respect and dignity. The church will remember her own history of being refugees in Egypt. That was us back in Egypt. We were strangers in a strange land, and the Lord was kind to us, cared for us, and brought us out. I think the church should be able to see through some of the scapegoating rhetoric that we find on the anti-immigration side. The reason why we have all these cultural problems is because of these other people who are coming into our country. Well, no, it doesn't take other people for us to mess up our culture. We've done a very good job of that, very much on our own. I mean, people were worried about Obama not being born in the United States, the whole birther thing with Obama. And the subtext behind that seemed to be that only a foreign country could produce somebody like Obama. Well, no. Ivy League schools produce people like Obama every day. It doesn't take some invasion from outside to produce somebody who has the outlook on the world that President Obama has. I think we can also see through some of the manipulations, again, of conservative anti-immigration media that trumpet every crime committed by an immigrant and don't remind you or don't tell you that the likelihood of an immigrant committing a crime is minuscule by comparison with the likelihood of an American citizen committing a crime. A far larger proportion of violent crimes in this country, far larger proportion, even adjusting for population and everything, far larger proportion are committed by citizens. We don't need immigrants to be threatened by violence. That happens from our own people. We can see the legitimate claims on different sides, and we can take up the cause of those who are being abused or oppressed on both sides. Citizens of the United States who are under duress economically because they're competing with immigrants who have snuck into the country without proper identification. We can recognize the legitimate claims that they have. We can also recognize the legitimate claims of, especially of those who have come into this country as children, left by their parents and have grown up in this country, never spoken a word of their parents' country of origin, never lived there that they can remember, and are now find themselves in an illegal status here in the United States. So this church has a particular opportunity, I think, to have a stance in this very heated debate. And if we do nothing else, as I said, we do nothing else than provide a space where there can be reasoned discourse about this, because much of the discourse is very irrational on both sides of the issue. Then the church is providing a public service. But I think we can do more. I think we need to press the case that Christianity is essential to our public health. And that brings me to the second issue, which is that of religion and public life. I addressed this a little bit in my first talk. The first layer of liberalism that I described as a religious liberty settlement that took form over several centuries following the Reformation. The issue that had to be addressed was the question of religious pluralism. Now you have Protestants and Catholics and varieties of Protestants and Catholics living in the same territory. How do you govern them? You can't make a Catholic version of Christianity foundational to your government, because that excludes from citizenship certain residents of your country. You can't make Protestantism the foundation, or certain kind of Protestantism, because that will exclude others. And one of the results of that, not an immediate result and not a universal result, but one of the results of that was to try to set up a religiously neutral and a theologically neutral state. The state is not a player in the religious conflicts. The state is a referee. That's the claim of liberal order. The state is a referee that makes sure that there's a level playing field, that everybody's playing by the rules, that no one gets an unfair advantage. They're not taking a stance on any of the theological judgments or divisions that exist within their country. Well, I think that's just impossible. And I think there's a growing body of literature that explains why that is impossible and why that hasn't worked. It's pretty clear that it isn't working when you have something like gay marriage approved by the Supreme Court. All the traditional definitions of marriage now have to be expunged from state constitutions. Everyone has to conform to this new marriage regime. That's that's public policy that is in direct conflict with Christian orthodoxy. And it's not a neutral stance to say that gays may now marry. That's an anti-Christian stance, as is the right to have an abortion that's been also established by the Supreme Court. It's become clear that liberal order does not simply play the referee, that they are taking sides, and that's inevitable. Suppose you're a 17th century prince, and you want to figure out how to govern this religiously divided populace that you're supposed to rule, and you do it by saying, well, transubstantiation, consubstantiation, potato, this means nothing to public life. Your views on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist can be your own private opinion, your own church opinion. They have no effect on public life. That sounds like, a reasonable political judgment. That's actually, obviously, a theological judgment. It's a theological judgment that views on the real presence are not relevant to politics. But Christians would say, particularly Catholics, medieval Catholics who believed in transubstantiation, would say, this is not a private issue. This is a fundamental to all of the church's order and the church's public presence and the church's public life. There's a theological judgment that's already inherent in that. The liberal states kind of modestly claim that they don't have competence to judge between religious claims. And so we're going to just stay out of this. We can't judge whether transubstantiation or consubstantiation or something else is true. We're just going to stay out. But if they were truly modest about it, if they were truly incompetent, then you would think that they would seek help from those who are competent, like theologians, who could competently address the issue. But they can't do that. They have to claim modesty. We're incompetent to make this decision. But that's, again, actually pressing for privatization of religious opinion, privatization of theological opinion, and it's not actually neutral. More insidiously, there's a kind of embedded anthropology in liberal order. Human beings are free actors, autonomous, that should be liberated to do whatever they like, as long as it doesn't disturb public order. There is an implicit anthropology in liberal order that goes contrary to Christian anthropology. There's an implicit ecclesiology, a doctrine of the church that's embedded in liberal order. Liberal order favors churches that don't believe the church should be a public institution, favors free church ecclesiologies, low church or Baptistic ecclesiologies, we might say. Liberal order is very consistent with that. If you have a public church, especially an international church like the Catholic Church, liberalism looks suspiciously on that, as Americans have done up until fairly recently. looked suspiciously on Catholics because Catholics seem to be divided in loyalty between the Pope and the President. Who are they going to follow when push comes to shove? Well, hopefully, we wish they would ask that question about every Christian, not just about Catholics. But Americans have accommodated their ecclesiologies and their church loyalties to make those private loyalties rather than public loyalties. So liberal order is not what it claims to be. It's not a simple referee adjudicating different claims. Rather, it is a player. Whatever its claims, it is in fact a player. And we can make that case in public, and I think we have plenty of evidence from recent Supreme Court decisions and recent trends in religious liberty issues to show that is in fact the case, that liberal order has this kind of impulse against Orthodox Christianity. Let me talk about freedom. I've talked about freedom a good bit in the past couple of days. Freedom as the driving ideology of liberalism, expanding personal choice, expanding personal autonomy. One of the manifestations of that leads into certain kinds of knots and contradictions. One of the manifestations in our culture is multiculturalism and the attack on the dominance or the hegemony of Western culture and Western civilization. That's in some ways an egalitarian impulse. You want to equalize all cultures. Cultures are all the same. You're leveling them all out. But it also is part of this drive for freedom. We want to liberate ourselves from these onerous traditions that oppress us, these traditions that we did not choose. We shouldn't be beholden to anything that we haven't chosen. And so multiculturalism is a part of that drive for liberation from the past. But a tradition is what makes us a people. We're Americans because we have a heritage of American life and American politics and American culture. We're a part of Western European civilization because we have this heritage. To be multicultural in the name of freedom is to want to be freed from being American. But this is an American drive toward freedom that we're talking about. The purest form of Americanism seems to be anti-Americanism. The purest form of freedom, which is the American value, is to throw off the shackles of the American past. Okay? That is what you call a contradiction. And it's the kind of knot that secular understandings of freedom get themselves into, and a tangle and a contradiction that it can't untangle. Let me try this, talk about freedom in a more philosophical vein. And this is I'm dependent here on some of the writings of Benedict XVI when he's written essays on freedom and truth and pointed to the abortion issue as kind of a focal issue in thinking about freedom. Women have the freedom to choose to abort their children. That is already a contradiction of an ideology of freedom because it doesn't recognize that the woman's freedom is exercised at the expense of the freedom of the unborn child. It doesn't recognize the reality, which is inevitable in any society, the reality of competing freedoms. The woman's freedom trumps the child's freedom. And the reason for that, the argument in favor of that, is that the child is a part of the woman's body. Has different limbs and has different parts and so on, but completely dependent on the woman's body. Comes from the woman and is completely dependent on the woman's body. If the child is taken out from the mother, then the child won't survive. And so that dependence leaves the child vulnerable to the woman's exercise of freedom. But is that child, that unborn child, who is dependent on another, who comes from another and is dependent on being with another, is that unborn child really different from all the rest of us? And Benedict XVI points out that, in fact, that unborn child is not. Human existence is existence from others, or born of other people, or born into traditions and lives that we didn't choose, Its existence independence on others, with others, and that existence from and with imposes obligation to live for others. That is the truth about human existence. We are from, we have being from, we have being with, we have, because of that, we have being for. That is the truth. And seeking freedom from that, we're seeking freedom from what makes us human. We're seeking freedom from the kinds of ties and obligations that are the very stuff of human life. We're trying to seek freedom from ourselves. We're trying to become God, but not really God, not the true God. We're trying to become the kind of God that Satan wanted to be, beholden to none, attached to none, trying to become devils by liberating ourselves from the very thing that makes us human. We're not trying to be like the true God, because the true God is, as human beings, a God who is for, from, and with. A father who is for his son, a son who is from his father, and a spirit who is with his father, the Father and the Son. That's the God in whose image we're made, and that internal Trinitarian life is what gives structure to human life. And when we try to free ourselves from that, we're freeing ourselves from ourselves. And again, we end up in contradiction. Secular freedom ends up contradicting itself, undermining itself. Let me end up, I don't have time to do all five, let me end up with one last one. And that is the issue of poverty and moral poverty. In America, at least, there's at least a perceived difference between liberal interest in people, especially oppressed, poor people, vulnerable people, and conservative insistence on moral requirements, moral rules. And these seem to be starkly different from each other, and they seem to be opposed to each other. I think we have an opportunity in our time to press for a different sort of response to these issues. Charles Murray, in a book called Coming Apart, Charles Murray long ago wrote a book called Losing Ground about the adverse effects of the welfare state. He's written on race in the past, and he's most recently written a book called Coming Apart, where he's describing the dislodging of creating two Americas, basically. And he studies not two actual communities, but two statistical cohorts. One of them he calls Belmont, and the other he calls Fishtown. Belmont is middle and upper middle class. Belmont is stable. Most of the people in Belmont are married. The marriages last. Surprisingly, the middle class and upper middle class residents of Belmont communities are more religious than the lower class communities of Fishtown. They have liberal values. They believe in being non-judgmental. They have relativistic convictions, but they don't actually live that way, because that would mean they wouldn't be able to maintain their upper middle class and upper class lifestyles. You can't give up all standards, can't give up the value of hard work and reliability and maintain a high income, or at least not very long. They have liberal values, permissive values, but they actually live fairly conservative lives. That's one quadrant of the United States. The people who are actually living the liberal values that the upper classes hold are the people of Fishtown. They're working class, they're poorer than the people in Belmont. Many of them are not married. Divorce rates are high. Illegitimacy is very high. They are not religious. They're less religious, at least, than the people in the Belmont quadrant, the people of the upper middle class. And what Murray comes to is that the central issue is not a matter of material wealth at all. The difference has to do with moral capital. It has to do largely with marriage and the stability of marriage. marriages being very stable in the upper middle classes and far less stable, falling apart in lower class communities. And behind that stability of marriage is the question of moral standards, whether moral standards are upheld, whether they actually live by the moral relativism that they profess. The lower class communities tend to, and upper class communities, because they're relativists, don't want to be judgmental of the behavior of people who are poorer than they are, less well off. They don't want to be judgmental, tell them not to practice certain things. But it's the moral relativism that undermines communities and leaves them vulnerable. So instead of this conservative liberal divide that I described, I think those who hold to absolute moral standards, Christians who hold to absolute moral standards, can present a case that the absolute moral standards that we advocate are actually far better for the poor and the vulnerable than the moral relativism that reigns in liberalism. We should advocate absolute moral standards for the sake of those who are vulnerable, because they're the ones that suffer most and pay the price of the non-judgmental relativism that is the established faith of our culture. Those are some of the ways that we can present a case for a Christian society. We can, the church can take a stance within the immigration issue that I think can be a healthy one to a public service. We can show how the supposedly neutral liberal state is in fact not. We can show how freedom detached from truth about humanity and truth about God is self-contradictory and ends up undermining itself. We can make a case that it's only by upholding absolute moral standards that we can actually defend the most vulnerable citizens of America. And all of those together, and many other ways that we could present, other issues we could present, I think all of those are illustrations of the opportunity that we have to present a case for a Christian society and the need to recover those foundations if our culture is going to be revived. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lightheart, and we'll go on break until 10 o'clock. Thank you.